vapor in the atmosphere. Oh, I got it. And it's because of these three phases that we have really the life that we do have on this planet, and that we're able to sustain and feed not just ourselves, but all the other flora and fauna have sustenance and help to feed us. So it's this temperature where all three phases of water, ice, water, and vapor, are available that makes this planet really very special and maybe even quite unique. So the plan of my talk is to tell you why the Earth is the temperature it is. In fact, it is warmer than we might expect. And I'll go into why there's still been an argument about it, why people are still discussing this 20, 30 years after the science was really settled. And that's actually, it's a bit of a horror story. Then I'll tell you how bad the problem is, how much greenhouse gas. I think you probably all know that's the cause. If you don't, by the end of the first section, I should have convinced you. So we have to remove greenhouse gases at enormous scale. And then I'll get it. That leads into, as I say, the other talks that are coming up in the series. So this is a mystery story. And like good mystery story, it has heroes and villains. It gets solved at the end, or as you probably know the solution. It's not all that mysterious. But the first hero in this story is a Swiss gentleman scientist, explorer, mountaineer by the name of Erastus of Sur, who came up with this idea. He knew about greenhouses. In fact, greenhouses been around, that is a glass-covered building, like glass at least on the roof, that traps heat and allows the growth of plants at reasonable temperatures indoors. And that was one sheet of glass. But Saussure said, well, what happens if we put on more sheets of glass? So he built a box and put on 2 and then 3. I don't think he went to 4, but he successively added layers. And each layer he got to higher and higher temperature, the whole box being insulated. So it was protected from, he went to the top of a mountain and the bottom of a valley and the sun shining on it. It was more or less the same temperature wherever he took it. And he was able, with this 3-layer structure, to get above the water if he put it instead of thermometers in his box. So that's a prologue. And the real hero is probably this Frenchman, Jacques Fourier. Was a well-connected, I don't know if he was a nobleman or not, but he was well-connected in Napoleon's administration. He was governor of Egypt when Napoleon was occupying Egypt with his French troops. He was also keenly interested in how heat went from one object to another. And he applied what he'd learned to the flow of heat into and out of the Earth. And I'll show you a picture of that in a moment, or explain it on this slide. Oh, you're seeing my view. Okay. All right. So that's the final picture. I was supposed to step through this and show you one of these screens. That's not going to work. But for the people on the Zoom call, I hope it's working. So he was analyzing the flow of heat around the Earth, and as we all know, the heat source for the Earth is the sun. So sunlight comes in, we call it shortwave radiation, because it's shorter than what comes next. Some of that gets reflected out. Ah, okay. Yeah. Oh, so you're in display mode now too. Good. Okay. So some of that sunlight is reflected, and I try to account for that. And the Earth then heats up, and day and night, as the sun turns, warms it up during the day, it starts radiating, gets warmer. Even at nighttime, it's radiating in the infrared. And so he analyzed how fast it warms up, how quickly it cools down, and he came to the conclusion that it's warmer than he expected. The cooling rate at night is what he rate during the day. So that's the mystery, that he suggested a solution. There's something in the atmosphere that prevents the heat from escaping, but he didn't know what it was. So what could this mystery substance be? The next person in the story is a heroine, rare female scientist in the middle of the 19th century, American scientist. She was born in New York, I think born in Connecticut, and lived in upstate New York. This is Eunice Newton Foote. And she was had a home lab. And the important thing to notice in this picture is the two cylinders in the window in the center. These are thermometers inside the cylinders. They're about 2.5 feet.
We can't hear you.
Hello? Oh, thought somebody said something. The gases she's interested in, and in particular, one of them.
Campbell, you're fading out sometimes. Stay close to
Oh,
the mic.
I'm sorry. I'll stand in front of the. Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, I have to stand in front of the microphone on the computer, so let me not move around too much. So she went outside with common air, oxygen and nitrogen mostly in one cylinder, and carbon dioxide in the other, and found that the one with carbon dioxide in it heated up more than the one with just common air in it. So knowing that this sunlight has this long wavelength radiation part of it, this infrared, goes beyond just the visible that we can see, but they know even in those days that there were dark rays carrying some heat in the infrared. So she concluded that this might be, she wouldn't go quite to say this is what it has to be, but she suggested that carbon dioxide, or as she called it, carbonic acid gas, is the substance that Fourier was hinting at, that was what he was looking for, and the explanation of the warm earth. At about the same time, and it's not clear whether John Tyndall, who's an Irishman working in England, working in London, whether he knew about Foote's work, but he did something very similar with a much more elaborate apparatus. Basically a heat source at one end, the boiling water at the right end of that tube, and the radiation from that going into the tube that held the gas he was testing. And then there's a detector at the end to see how much of the gas gets through. So he did experiments with this apparatus and concluded that carbon dioxide not only absorbs infrared radiation, it also emits infrared radiation. So this is about 1860 or so. And 40 years after that, along comes the next guy. So this is going to be a theoretical analysis. He's got all the facts. I'm missing out some of it, But by the end of the 19th century, everything was in place for this guy, Arrhenius, I'll show you his face in a minute, to analyze what's going on in the atmosphere. Lisa, please. This one absorbs and emits. This is the atmosphere. It's about 5 miles thick. And this is an Apollo photograph taken at sunrise that highlights just how thin this layer of atmosphere is. So Arrhenius starts analyzing this, and he looks at the energy coming in from the sun, and that had been estimated now quantitatively by another scientist that I omitted from this story, otherwise it gets too long. So he knows how much energy is coming in. He knows, because of the radiation from black bodies that another scientist analyzed, how much is leaving the Earth's surface and how much gets absorbed. So some of it goes straight out into space, some of it gets absorbed. And then the atmosphere, because of what Tyndall told him, is emitting, and it's emitting in all directions, up and down, sideways as well. I'm just showing you what's going up and down. So Arrhenius calculated on the basis of that the Earth should be warm because of the carbon dioxide, and every time the carbon dioxide doubled in concentration, it would increase in temperature by about 4 degrees centigrade. So he knew this 120 plus years ago. And this was a big deal. It was reported all over the world. In particular, this newspaper in the remote section of New Zealand, literally the end of the earth compared to where Arrhenius was working. And the report went, we're burning 2 billion tons of coal every year. And when that combines with oxygen, that's 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. And Arrhenius, this is reporting what Arrhenius said, that in a couple of 100 years, we might notice it. A few centuries. So that was a situation. Now that got sort of put aside because there was a botched experiment by another guy who should be infamous, but has actually got a Nobel Prize for something else, not for the botched experiment. But it was reborn because of this guy. He was a steam engineer. He designed steam engines for ships. And during the war, Second World War, he was employed by the Royal Navy. But through all of this career of his, he was an amateur meteorologist. And he did one of the most amazing things I think I've read about. He went through the records from wherever he could find them for 50 years worth of temperature records all over the civilized planet, where people were starting to have weather stations and recording the temperature. He also got measurements of carbon dioxide that other people were measuring and reporting. That's kind of spotty, because if you do it near an industrial plant or in a city, it's going to be high. But he found that maybe there was about a 6% increase in carbon dioxide over that same period, roughly the same period. And he matched it to the sale of coal, because the coal merchant, the coal miners, mining companies reported how much coal they sold. And it all fit together. And started, after Callender announced this and publicized it, he got a lot of attention. And that really started a lot of new pieces of research. Look. Oh, I can't move it too far. Okay, I'll try to signal to you. So one of these guys who picked up, didn't know there was an intervening war, so it wasn't picked up immediately, but a number of countries started a serious program in climate research, including the United States now. And this gentleman, Charles Keeling, was a geochemist, a physical chemist, who understood extremely well how to detect greenhouse gases, infrared active, infrared absorbing gases. So he was asked by the government to design a detector, and it went up to the top of Mauna Loa. So now he's away from all sources of carbon dioxide, all the industrial plants in the cities. Another one in the Antarctic. Here are the results from Mauna Loa for the past, 60 years, starting in 1958 to about 2020. And you can see it's rising from 320 parts per million. Doesn't sound like much, but it's rising steadily to 420. Now that 320 is already 100 years after, 200 years after the Industrial Revolution. So before the Industrial Revolution, ice cores show that the number was about 280 parts per million. So it's gone up from 280 to 420 in less than 300 years. That's a 50% increase. People want to know, what are these wiggles on the graph? What are all the red dots? The blue line is the average, and the up and down is the annual variation. And in the summertime in the Northern Hemisphere, the conifer trees in Siberia and Canada and Scandinavia start to photosynthesize. So from May to about September, the concentration goes down, and in the winter time it goes up. But every year it goes up a little bit more than it goes down. So it's accumulating in the atmosphere. I'm now going to get a little bit more technical, because this is the nail in the coffin of the proof, as far as I'm concerned, that it is human emission that is doing it. Because there's a fingerprint in the infrared radiation. So this gentleman, Wilhelm Wien, German scientist, deduced what the black body spectrum should be, what the sun at the temperature of click, at a temperature of 5,500 degrees Kelvin should emit, and how that moves. It goes down in intensity and moves to the infrared as an object gets cooler. Now the Earth is just about 300 degrees Kelvin, so it's shifted way out for the radiation out of the Earth. So actually, Arrhenius already knew this. It was published a few years before Arrhenius. It was part of his calculation. But I wanted to show you that curve because we're going to superimpose it on this fingerprint. This is the infrared absorption of water vapor and carbon dioxide. And the main thing to look at is that carbon dioxide has a peak at 15 microns. That's the wavelength in length units. Micron is a millionth of a meter. And that's in a region where water is more or less transparent. There's a window of transparency in water centered at about 10 microns. So carbon dioxide is sort of blocking that window in the atmosphere. And you can see that from this, one of the earliest satellite measurements, space measurement from the Nimbus space mission in 1970, roughly. So one of the very early scientific satellites. And what you're seeing there, the dotted lines are the black body spectrum. This is looking at the Sahara Desert. The satellite's flying over the Sahara Desert. And the 320 curve, the dotted line is what you would expect for the black body curve. The dips in it are absorption from carbon dioxide. Look at the top scales, 15 microns. And then water to the left of that, longer wavelength, 20 microns. So ozone is marked there, methane is marked there. There's more water absorption out at shorter wavelength, higher wave number. I apologize for the units. I cannot find a consistent set of graphs with all the right units on it. So yes, carbon dioxide is absorbed on its way out, but it's not completely absorbed. There's still 50 units of radiation, where incoming radiation is completely blocked at that wavelength because the atmosphere is getting denser and denser all the way to the bottom. Finally, it blocks. What's happening is radiation is coming from the Earth, gets absorbed in the lower atmosphere, emits again in all directions, goes up until it gets to the thin part of the atmosphere where it's no longer being strongly absorbed. And so that is at a height corresponding to about 220 Kelvin. So the atmosphere is cool as you go higher, got less dense, and so the emission from carbon dioxide at that height is able to escape into space. So the fingerprints here are almost literally that. That's it, puts these gases at the scene of the crime. What about on the Earth? What about on the surface of the Earth? Well, here's 3 traces from ground-based measurements now, looking up into the sky. The blue curve is looking into clear sky. And you see again the fingerprint of carbon dioxide being emitted by the atmosphere coming back down to Earth. You see ozone emitting as well, and you see methane. And if it's cloudy or water moisture in the atmosphere, you see the emission from clouds. The green curve is a relatively thin cloud, and the thicker cloud is red. So I consider that an open and shut case, that radiation is leaving the Earth, eventually gets out into space, but some of it gets radiated back down, and therefore the Earth is not cooling as quickly as you would otherwise think, just as Fourier said 200 years ago, almost to the year. One more hero, and that's Ben Santer. He's a scientist at Lawrence Livermore, not very far from here. And he analyzed satellite data, did modeling of it. I won't show you the models. The data look like this. This is a map of the warming rate, how fast the atmosphere is warming as a function of latitude from the South Pole on the left to the North Pole on the right, and as a function of altitude on the vertical scale here. Strange units, so it's pressure, so going up, the pressure is going down, but that corresponds to a height in the atmosphere. And what you see is the red and yellow are all warming. That is getting warmer. So the equator and towards the North Pole, the warming's quite excessive, quite measurable, high. And the blues and the purples are cooling. The upper atmosphere is cooling. That's exactly what you expect if the source of the heat, source of this new heat that's changing the temperature, is coming from below. If you want to get warm, you go and stand close to the fire, right? I mean, it's the further away from the heat source, the cooler it gets. And if the heat is being absorbed, the heat doesn't get to the top of the atmosphere, upper atmosphere. So this is yet another piece of proof that Fourier was right, because he posed it as a mystery because he didn't know what the material was, but he understood the principle. So here's the sort of a kicker. The temperature been rising from the Industrial Revolution through to the present day. And carbon dioxide has been rising as well, and is now over 400 parts per million. We're up to 420. This was almost a decade ago. So why are we still discussing it? Why is there still not a consensus even amongst some scientists? Now 90+% of scientists agree that this is the right story, but there's still some who deny it. So this is another crime. When I was a graduate student, Exxon was a well-established lab. They had a great reputation. They were doing climate science, and in fact, they were among the leaders in climate science in the 70s. They were at all the conferences. They were publishing. They had, this is two examples quoted by this news organization. They understood what the poles were doing, especially the North Pole, and how when that melts and the sea ice clears, it's going to heat up more. This feedback effect, the reflectivity of ice. Also, where the carbon goes. Once we generate carbon dioxide, it goes out into the atmosphere, it goes from there into land, into the forests and so on. It also goes into the oceans. The oceans re-emit, and so there's cycles, carbon cycles. Exxon scientists studied that and published and were well-respected climate scientists. 1977, they published an internal assessment of what was going on. That doubling carbon dioxide would increase the global temperature by roughly 3 degrees, and by three times that, by 10 degrees at the poles. That's in agreement with Arrhenius, that he was in the same ballpark. And that is basically the current best modeling and the current best analysis agrees with that. So Exxon knew. And a year after the internal report didn't publish this, it went to the management, and the management, well, we better look into this some more. So they increased the budget for climate science. Not quite sure why. I don't think it was ulterior. No, don't think it was altruism. It was an ulterior motive. 10 years later, Jim Hansen, who you may have heard of, published, testified before Congress, the so-called Gore Committee. He said warming has begun. I mean, now the signal that the amount of warming is measurable, and it's bigger than the noise of the data. But very next year, the American Petroleum Institute, which is all the big oil companies, began to finance a campaign to sow doubt and confusion among not just scientists, but among the general public and politicians and voters. And that was a very successful campaign, because to this day, there are still people that think that the science is not what I just told you. And even a decade after, a couple of decades after that, Exxon were now spending more money on this denial campaign than they were on climate science. So follow the money. I need to settle for water. So I can tell you by reading the literature whether the piece was written by a denier or not, because they have their favorite phrases. The climate's not changing. That was 20, 30 years ago. Well, it is changing. The average temperature has gone up. I showed you the graph. Floods and droughts are clearly getting more severe and more intense. Oh, well, then the climate has always changed. Well, that's true. That's true. But it has never, the temperature in particular has never risen quite so fast as it's rising now. the closest anything's come to it is at the end of the ice ages. Each ice age, as the water oceans start to warm up, they release carbon dioxide. There's a solubility of carbon dioxide in water goes down. If you take a cold soda bottle out of the fridge and pour it into a warm glass, it fizzes because all the carbon dioxide comes out of it. Well, the ocean didn't fizz, but they released carbon dioxide that accelerated the warming after the ice age, bringing you out of the ice age. Humans can't affect such a large system. We can't possibly affect the Earth. It's too big. Well, we've put 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and as I said earlier, raised the concentration from 280 parts per million to 520. It's the sun. Well, no, it's not. Not the sun. Last 50 years, the temperature has been rising. And during that same period, the irradiation from the sun has been declining overall. These oscillations are sunspot. That's the sun's 11-year sunspot cycle. And that peaked about 50 years ago. And we're going into what they call the grand solar minimum right about now. So sun is going the wrong way to explain any warming at all. What about volcanoes? There's all sorts of whataboutisms. Well, volcanoes have been studied. In 2013, 33 volcanoes were studied by a whole bunch of volcanomics studiers of volcan. Oh, okay. And they used that data from these 33 as representative of the rest, and decided that the total emission from volcanoes is less than a gigaton per year, whereas humans are putting 29 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. What the volcanoes do, this picture of Etna shows you all the dust that comes out of the volcano. And that dust, so that dust you can see very clearly every time there's a volcanic eruption. Pinatubo, the most famous one we probably all remember, but going back earlier all the way through the century, the big eruptions are all associated with cooling events, and then the temperature goes back to roughly where it was before. So volcanoes have a cooling effect and don't emit enough carbon dioxide to have substantial warming. So this is sort of how it's represented in some reports. Human cause. So this is what they call it forcing. This is how much can you blame on a particular cause. So human cause is somewhere about 2 of these units, watts per square meter, extra heat reaching the ground. Now, solar and volcanoes have a little effect, so they're not totally zero, but the error bars, they might as well be very close to zero. What about El Nino? I told you, what aboutism? What about this? What about that? That's how doubt gets so. Well, El Nino and La Nina are oscillations of warm water on the Pacific surface going back and forth from the west side of the Pacific to the east, back and forth. And it has this sort of variation. Sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes the other way. The red line is the average, time average, and it's absolutely flat. It doesn't change anything. And the reason is this sloshing back and forth doesn't put any heat into the Earth system or out of it. The balance at the top of the atmosphere, more coming in, warms the Earth, more going out, it would cool, but this doesn't change the amount of heat in the Earth system. I need to speed up. I'll let you read through these as Lisa clicks through them. So we've eliminated every other cause and supported greenhouse gases as the major cause and no other cause comes close to the magnitude of the effect or the time dependence of the effect of the rapid rise we're having now for the last 200 or 300 years. For the audience online, I better leave this up just a little bit longer because I wasn't clicking fast enough to let them read it. So as far as most scientists are concerned, this is as close to a cut and dried case as you can get in science. It's something like 99% certainty, unless somebody comes up with another whatism, whataboutism, but they're not on the horizon that I'm aware of. So don't be double crossed by Exxon and the other members of that group. So we all know the consequences. Warm air causes droughts and storms and wildfires, melts glaciers. Warm ocean causes hurricanes, the sea level rise. So these are all expensive, damaging events that we're paying for now. I didn't really go into much detail about acidification of the ocean, but carbonic acid gas, as Eunice Newton-Foote called it, is acid, and that gets in the ocean and prevents shellfish from making their shells, slows down shellfish formation and certain kinds of plankton, which are fish food. So it's having an effect on ocean fisheries. So I'm getting close to the end. So although it's only looks like it's halfway, the other two sections are relatively short. The scale of the problem is that we're emitting, I think I've used this number before, 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year from fossil fuels and other industrial processes like cement making and agriculture. Land use change is clearing forests and clearing woodland to build new houses or to put in agriculture, or clearing agriculture to put in housing, housing development. So that goes in the positive side of when we're talking about sources. The excess carbon dioxide goes into forests. That's the main land sink. It goes into the atmosphere first, but some of it stays there, and some goes eventually into the ocean. So these are the main sinks, and it's closely balanced, but the stuff in the atmosphere is what is warming it. So there are other greenhouse gases as well. I've sort of glossed over it. So this chart divides it into two kinds of carbon dioxide. One is from fossil fuels and industrial processes. The other is from agriculture or forestry. Methane is a greenhouse gas as well. That's emitted mostly from leaks in natural gas pipelines, also from agriculture. You've probably heard about cows belching. It's the front end that the methane comes up, mostly. Nitrous oxide is from fertilizer and some other industrial processes. And fluorinated gases are refrigerants. So, and that with some of them cause the ozone hole as well. So that's the most efficient ecosystems to capture carbon were outlined by this Danish university. Tundra is at the top. Basically, what goes into the tundra goes into the soil, gets frozen in there when the tundra is doing its photosynthesis. It doesn't really get out again. It gets underground and gets frozen. The next three are all in the class what I would call tidal wetlands, where the sea meets the land, and that is the most efficient of all. But it's a relatively small area because it's just on the margins of the continent. And tropical forests, of course, the Amazon, Congo area, Indonesia, are up there. So forests and grasslands are both good, and they have pros and cons. Forests sequester a lot, but they release it when they burn. Grasslands store it underground mostly, it goes into the root systems. So when it burns, it may take the grass off the surface, but what is underground stays there, and then the grasses can tear it back up again pretty fast after a wildfire. That these wetlands sequester about 10 times as much carbon dioxide acre for acre as tropical forests. And they're all over the margins of the continents. This is in the Everglades. This is right nearby, the Alcal Slough and Monterey Bay. Another place in Monterey is kelp beds. So kelp is a very good, and that is floating near the surface and going up and down in the tides, and it's all part of, kelp is capturing a lot of carbon dioxide. So the IPCC has all these scenarios. So I just want to give you a quick idea of why we need to do more than just reduce fossil fuel burn, why net zero in that sense is not enough. So this is a range of carbon dioxide from the IPCC scenarios, from basically continuing more or less as we're doing now, maybe slowing down a little bit, to a very rapid slowing down of carbon dioxide emission. And we're not doing that. And therefore, carbon dioxide, one way or another, is accumulating in the atmosphere. This is the concentration getting well above the current 400 ppm by the end of the century. And maybe if we do really well, but we're not on track for that, maybe it will eventually turn over and slow down a little bit. But the truth of the matter is we're probably somewhere in between these two extreme scenarios. And therefore, the temperature is going to continue rising. We get up to 15 degrees centigrade. That's 1.5 degrees that everybody's trying to aim for, but it ain't going to happen because we're not acting fast enough. So even the most optimistic scenario is not enough. We've got to get rid of carbon dioxide. And that's what's going into all of these nationally determined contributions. This is the United Nations. Each country has to voluntarily agree to do something about carbon dioxide, stop emitting it, and now capture it. Okay. So that brings me to what you can expect over the next few months. So the emphasis of these talks and what we've tried to arrange is removal of carbon dioxide and also methane. It doesn't mean we can do anything about the emission. We've got to keep doing emission reduction as well as remove carbon dioxide. There's a book by Peter Fikowski called Climate Restoration, and he gives 3 criteria for removal technologies. The technology must remove it permanently, so it doesn't get buried somewhere and then comes straight back out again. It should be scalable. We've got to capture tens of gigatons per year to make up for all that we've been emitting the last 200-300 years. And ideally, it should be self-financing. It should satisfy some market, either food or construction, and some of the solutions you will hear are in that category, so that in the end, it's not costing anything. It's the product of the sequestration is a commodity that can be sold and it finances itself. And ideally, these processes should be the way the geology does it, geomimetic, or the way that biology does it, biomimetic. So the speakers we have lined up are these. Next month, Brian von Herzen, who is a marine biologist, will tell us about marine permaculture, making forests in the seas, basically floating kelp. And I won't steal his thunder. But, so the uses of kelp are enormous. There's a lot of things can be done with kelp. And if you don't do anything with it, it sinks the sea floor and stays in the deep ocean. A little bit different. Armand Nuckermans is an organization called Marine Cloud Brightening. That sounds like a little bit like geoengineering, which has got a bad tone to it, but their approach to geoengineering is very cautious and ecologically probably quite friendly. It's in testing phase. I don't know how much he's going to be able to tell us about the results of these tests, but it sounds like a good idea if it works. Brent Constance is a Blue Planet Systems. They have a way of making concrete that is carbon negative. In the end, it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into buildings, putting it into basements and roadbeds and docks and construction. Lisa Friedman and Herman Geer will talk about the business climate and what is going on in the business world. And it's like Silicon Valley in the 1970s, 1980s. The number of venture capital funds and startup companies and the innovations that they're bringing. Some of them won't work. Not every computer company was as successful as Apple, but that is the sort of climate that we're seeing now. And the fifth talk we have lined up already, as I say, we're working on more, are using bugs, anaerobes, the scientific term for a bug, that turn agricultural waste that would normally emit lots of methane, making fertilizer out of it, putting it back in the soil. So that's my cox of anaerobe systems. And as I say, more to come. So that's what you might expect over the next few months. I'm happy to take questions and even have a discussion. Now, the people on the Zoom call, if you want to have a question, please put it in the chat room, and we'll try and read it here and announce it so that everybody can see it, because we had some technical difficulties and the connections are not what we were really expecting. So please put it in the chat. I'm going to look at the chat right now. I see 3 things in there. Oh, okay, one. All right. Okay. Well, I was being told to speak into the microphone. So I did keep turning, I admit it, I kept turning towards the screen here, and I've got to reposition, make sure the podium is better lined up. Although hopefully we'll have a better mic and a whole lot more better technology future talks. So bear with us. This was the first experiment. I hope you got something out of the talk. There's a question here. I'm going to repeat it. Yeah. Yes, that is our intention, to have it at this venue and to have it on Zoom each month. It may depend. We can only book this a month ahead, I think. So if somebody else gets in before we do, then we might have to move. But hopefully it will be here and by Zoom.
So many people say we don't focus enough on methane. What is the percentage of methane? So
Methane is, well, methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas. And the numbers, but it's also shorter lived. It's getting worse from human emission as well. So yeah, the permafrost emitting methane is really a dangerous thing. And when permafrost warms up too much, there's going to be a runaway effect. At the moment, the numbers I hear, depending on the timescale you're talking about, it's equivalent of taking us from 420 parts per million where we are now to about 500 to 520. So it's about a 20% increase. Yes, there is. So one of the talks we're trying to line up is from an organization called Methane Action. And they have a technology that's called enhanced atmospheric methane oxidation, which is there's a little bit of geoengineering again to seed clouds and so on to accelerate the rate of methane oxidation. That creates carbon dioxide. 1 molecule of carbon dioxide for every molecule of methane, CH4 going to CO2 and water.
Any more questions?
Yeah, we got a question about land use. I'm not sure I have all the question yet. We need a slide to illustrate it. So let me see if I can go back to oh, I've lost my share somehow. Let me share again. Okay, I'm going to describe what we're looking at here. Like, yeah. So this is the carbon dioxide. The land use positive, and the atmosphere ocean. Yeah, there's a lot of fluctuations, especially in massive. I don't know the origin of that, but I think it has to do with massive fires, wildfire. The government and those things means it's still for 1 year. Yeah. That's I really don't understand the operation. I really use this to take a trend. So if you want to look into it and find out, let me know, because yeah, these are wide fluctuations, especially in the land. The rest, there's spikes in the data, the fluctuation. The wide fluctuation in the land use. Zero. Yeah, there were some years we're visiting the whole northern hemisphere, all over Siberia, Canada, and North America. So that could be.
Also right here, Steve is so. Where. Maybe.
So the burning would do that, would turn the land of the city into
Is there a consensus on warming, or still debate on? Certain consensus.
So that is happening. The question is, how is it accelerating? How is that process accelerating? Because once the temperature depends on the growth depends on global temperature. I'm sorry. My hearing and your, can you take your mask? Is about the killing curve and the oscillations. These are annual oscillations. So there's emission going on most of the time. So the question then is how much is being taken out of the atmosphere? And the northern forest, so-called boreal forests in Siberia, Canada, northern hemisphere, in the summertime, the trees start growing, right? They start photosynthesizing. First of all, again, more sunshine, but they're also warming up and being more active. So it's that massive sink of the carbon in the northern hemisphere that takes the net concentration in the atmosphere down. So that's the downward part of the curve, and the rest is some of it's human, but the rest are natural processes where carbon dioxide is emitted by humans breathing, by animals breathing, all sorts of other sources. The southern hemisphere has so much less land. Land area is so much less. It's mostly ocean in the southern hemisphere. Yeah, well, it's really close to the equator. And they call it well-mixed atmosphere. Apparently, it's mostly homogeneous. So this is typical of the global average because carbon dioxide mixes very quickly across the equator.
Problem. Why are the presentations monthly apart?
Why are the presentations?
Why can you not do that presentation on a weekly basis?
Oh.
There's some folks who want to get involved on having actually the knowledge more condensed is also beneficial.
Yeah, we're part of the reason is we're all volunteers. The other is organizing, lining up a speaker once a month was sufficiently hard. I've in fact given four talks in the past 4 weeks, but they weren't all exactly the same, and some of them were even just half an hour long, and one was an hour and a half. Kept this one pretty close to an hour, so doing okay there. I think the main reason is this is not a bring in speakers on a weekly basis, seminars and so on. We've got to do a lot of legwork to find willing speakers, and I don't want to speak every week. I mean, I could. I have enough material that I could cover a lot of subjects, but I'd rather have this experts go into it in more detail. Okay.
So
Oh, yeah.
this one list from the university with the 5 biggest things. You know, there was this one slide.
These one?
No.
No.
Oh.
That was the last slide.
Grass and
Denmark University. Yeah,
Yeah.
go back about 3 or 4 more. One more. That one.
yeah, this one. Yeah, I was missing the magnitude on these.
That one does not. I quoted the magnitude, especially of the coastal wetlands. Tidal.
The tundra is at 10 times more better than the tropical forest, or
No, tundra is top of the list. Now, I don't know what they mean by efficient, but I think that means how much is captured per unit area.
in the area. Yeah,
Yes.
right. So then it would be interesting to know what the total amount is.
Yeah.
Right, that's why so then the tundra looks like much better than the forest, yeah. To take care of. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because this doesn't give me much of on which one should I be worried about the Amazon forest being burned? The burned is bad anyway. Cut down. Yeah, I should worry about it, but we need to start somewhere. The tundra is hard to. What do we do about it? Yeah,
I mean, it's hard to do biomimicry in the tundra, right? I mean, it's because I think it's because it's seasonal, and damp in the spring and summer. So there's a lot of bioactivity going on, and then it's going into the soil. It's peat bogs, most of that, which is it goes into the root system, and then freezes there. That's my understanding, but that's
the trend that goes from Beijing to Tibet, the Chinese put already the cooling systems in underneath the track because they knew it will get warm and so up, and then the track will fail.
Yeah. That's one.
So,
Yes, I believe it is. Yes. I actually looked for that in the description of the chart and I couldn't find it, but a quick calculation, it's of that order of magnitude that a relatively small amount of methane, but creates something. I said 20%, maybe, so no, it's 16 versus 75.
that would be directly the temperature proportion.
So that's the effect on the temperature. It's the effect of the gas. I'm not, as I say, I've tried to look into it. There's not that much methane. It's parts per billion compared to parts per million. So there's not enough methane to account for that much of the pressure. Yeah. There's way much. But these fluorinated gases are very, very efficient, and they've got huge infrared absorption, as well as eating ozone.
Did we lose audio?
it's a huge proportion of methane that is used gets leaked to the joints all over in our houses and on the pipelines underground and everywhere. Okay, I'm sorry for the people on Zoom. I understand those probably not so as effective as we would have liked. But thanks for those of you who stayed on, especially you, Sean, and for your attempts to help us. So,
On behalf of the Guadalupe group, thank you, Campbell.
okay, thank you very much.
And thanks to everybody who attended.
Yes. Yeah. We've learned a lot of lessons. Hopefully we can take them to heart. So thank you all for coming and hope to see you again in the future.
Goodbye.
Good night.